My brother stood up at his third anniversary dinner and announced they were taking a 2-week trip to Europe. He'd chosen the restaurant. He'd ordered the wine. 14 family members sat around a long table in the kind of warm amber light that makes everything feel like a celebration. My mother clapped. My father raised his glass. I reached into the bag on the back of my chair. I took out a printed bank statement. 3 pages, paper clipped together. The account number at the top was one I recognized. The name on the account was mine. I placed it in front of my father's wine glass without saying anything. He looked at it. He looked at me. The page showed $27,200 transferred out of my wedding fund over 18 months. My brother was announcing a European vacation with the last of what had been meant to pay for my wedding day. He didn't know I had the statement. He didn't know I'd spent 3 weeks building the full picture. He just didn't know it yet. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you are right now. Now let me take you back 9 years, to a Tuesday afternoon in November, and a woman named Ruth who wrote financial advice on recipe cards. My name is Jess. I'm 29 years old. I am engaged to Ryan, who is patient and kind and is currently planning a wedding without a budget, which is its own kind of love. My grandmother Ruth was my father's mother. She died 6 years ago at 83, and the clearest way I can describe her is this: she had spent 60 years making things last. Not because she was poor, she wasn't, exactly. But she had grown up during a time when money was real in a way that feels abstract now. When you knew exactly what you had because the alternative to knowing was running out. She had carried that knowledge forward into every decade of her life, and it made her precise in a way I found fascinating as a child and have come to understand as an adult. She organized her kitchen in the same way she organized her finances. Everything labeled. Everything in its place. Things used before they expired and replaced before they ran out. She wrote notes on recipe cards. Not just recipes, everything. Household records, gift records, accounts of things given and received. When she gave money, she wrote it on a card. When she planned to give money, she wrote that on a card too. When I was 12, she sat me at her kitchen table on a November afternoon that smelled like cinnamon and the particular damp wool of coats left on the back of a chair in winter. She opened a tin. The kind that used to hold shortbread, pale blue with a tartan pattern, and she took out a recipe card. The card said, at the top in her firm handwriting, Jess's wedding fund. Below that, a number, opening balance, $4,200. Below that, contributions planned through Jess's 25th birthday, additional $8,400. She held it out for me to read. She said, I've been putting money aside for your wedding since you were born. Every birthday, every Christmas, part of what would have gone toward other things. This is what's there so far and what's planned. I was 12. I didn't fully understand what I was looking at. She said, I'm showing you because I want you to know it exists. Not so you plan around it, just so you know it's there. A gift takes more meaning when the person knows it was built for them. She put the card back in the tin. She said, your parents know about it. It's in a dedicated account. When the time comes, they'll help you access it properly. I nodded like I understood. I understood enough. For the next 3 years, Grandma Ruth added to the fund on my birthday and at Christmas. She showed me the running total once a year, always on a recipe card, always updated in her handwriting. By the time she died, the fund held $22,400. My parents told me afterward that relatives had continued contributing, aunts who knew about the fund, cousins who had been told where to send birthday money. Another $6,000 over 4 years, in checks and transfers. By the time I got engaged to Ryan at 28, the fund should have held $28,400. I want to tell you about my brother Daniel before I tell you what the fund actually held. Daniel is 33. He married Claire 4 years ago in an expensive wedding, a beautiful one, the kind with a band and a florist and a venue that required a deposit 9 months in advance. My parents contributed significantly to that wedding. They were proud to. Daniel is their firstborn, and the wedding was exactly the kind of occasion my parents had imagined for their children. What I didn't know at the time was what else they'd contributed, and what it had come from. I should tell you that Daniel and I have always been close in the way of siblings who spent their childhood negotiating the same small space. We fought. We covered for each other. We sat in the same backseat on long drives and developed the same dark humor about our parents' habit of playing the same 3 cassette tapes. He is not a villain. But he made choices that had a cost he didn't pay. Looking back now, there were signs. The way my parents changed the subject when, at 25, I'd casually mentioned asking about the wedding fund someday. My mother had said, "Oh, there's plenty of time," and moved on. The way my father had looked at Daniel once, at Christmas, when someone mentioned the fund in passing. a look I'd filed away as nothing in particular. The way Daniel had bought a new car the year after his wedding and said, "Dad helped a bit," without elaborating. I'd filed all of it. I trusted that the account was what they'd told me it was. I was wrong by $27,200. Ryan proposed in March. The ring was simple. We'd chosen it together, which felt more honest than a surprise, and the afternoon we went to pick it up, he held my hand in the car on the way home and said, "So, we're doing this. We were doing this." The planning started gently. Venues, rough guest counts, a sense of what we wanted. And in May, 6 weeks after the engagement, I called my mother to ask about accessing the wedding fund. The pause before she answered was 3 seconds long. I know, because I counted them without knowing why. She said, "Let me talk to your father, sweetheart. I'll call you back." She called back 4 hours later. Her voice was careful in a way it only gets when she is managing something difficult. She said, "There's been some movement in the account. We should sit down and go through it together. In person." I said, "How much is in it?" Another pause. She said, $1,240. I sat down on the floor of my kitchen. The phone was still in my hand. $1,240. I had been planning a wedding around $28,400. I told Ryan that evening. He listened the way he always listens, completely, without preparing his response while I was still talking. When I finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I need to understand what happened first." He said, "Okay, then we figure out what to do." That was enough. For that night, that was everything. I went to see my parents 3 days later, Saturday. Their kitchen. The same kitchen where I'd grown up, where my mother still kept the same ceramic rooster on the counter that had been there my entire life. My father sat at the table looking like a man who had been dreading this for a long time and was relieved that the dreading was over. My mother made tea she didn't drink. They told me, together in the way of two people who have rehearsed something and are still getting it wrong, that Daniel had needed help, several times. Several different things. The first, a shortfall on the deposit for their house. They'd lent him $8,000 from the wedding fund, expecting him to repay before I needed it. He hadn't. The second, a car, $4,500. The third, a renovation to the kitchen of the house, $6,200. The fourth, a vacation they described as a family trip to Italy, which I'd seen photos of on social media and had genuinely thought they'd paid for themselves, $7,800. Other amounts, smaller, added up. My mother said, "He was always going to pay it back." My father said, "We kept believing that." They had believed it for 18 months. While I had been engaged in planning and imagining a specific future built on a specific number, they had been watching that number disappear in installments, each time telling themselves it was the last one. I said, "Did you tell me?" My father looked at his hands. No, they hadn't told me. That wasn't the worst part. I drove home and I called Natalie. Natalie is my best friend. She has known me for 14 years and she is constitutionally incapable of telling me only what I want to hear, which is exactly what I needed. I told her everything, the amounts, the timeline, the $1,200. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Jess, when did your parents transfer the money to Daniel? Do you have dates?" I said, "They said it was over 18 months. She said, "When did he buy that car? When did the renovation happen?" I went back through my memory, then through my social media, then through text threads. The car, Daniel had mentioned it in a group text in September of the previous year. My grandparents' 60th anniversary was in August, the month before. Extended family gathering. Multiple relatives had contributed to the wedding fund at that event. The vacation photos, posted in July. My parents had transferred money in June, Daniel's birthday month, when extended relatives routinely sent him gifts. The renovation, announced in March. My grandmother's death anniversary in February. People who had known her, people who had contributed to the fund in her memory, had sent donations in February. I sat at my kitchen table with a pen and a piece of paper. What I was seeing wasn't coincidence. The transfers to Daniel were timed in the months after events when family money flowed in. He hadn't borrowed impulsively. He had been borrowing strategically. Each time a contribution arrived, a request followed. I put the pen down. I stared at what I'd written. I thought, I should have seen it sooner. Then I thought, no one should have to see this. You shouldn't have to audit your parents' transactions to know whether the money being held for you is safe. That was not a personal failure. That was a broken promise, sustained over 18 months, by people who had loved me my whole life and had made a series of decisions that they'd convinced themselves were temporary. I picked up the pen. I started building a different document. I asked my mother, in a follow-up call, to send me the full transaction history of the wedding fund account. She sent it reluctantly, apologetically, with a message that said, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have told you sooner." The PDF arrived on a Tuesday evening. I opened it. There were 41 transactions over 22 months. 41. Not the 4 large transfers my parents had described. 41 entries, some large, many small. Amounts of 200, 300, 500, the kind of amounts that feel innocuous individually and devastating in aggregate. And on every 5th or 6th transaction, a note in the memo field. For Daniel, per Allen, my father's name. Authorized by my father. Not Daniel acting unilaterally. My father, each time, approving the transfer. I read the memo field on the 41st transaction. For Dan and Claire anniversary trip. Per Allen. I looked at the date. The transfer had been made 14 days ago. 14 days ago. The anniversary party was in 8 days. I closed the PDF. I sat very still. And I thought about what my grandmother had written on a recipe card when I was 12. A gift takes more meaning when the person knows it was built for them. She was right. It takes something else entirely when the person finds out it was taken from them. I did not call my parents. Not that night. Not the following day. I sat with the transaction history and I thought about the difference between reacting and responding. Between the release of saying everything you feel the moment you feel it and the harder, more purposeful thing, building what you want to say exactly before you say it. I had 8 days before the anniversary party. Natalie came over on Wednesday. I showed her everything. She read the transaction history, all 3 pages, every line. When she finished, she set the pages on my kitchen table and looked at me. She said, "What do you want to happen?" I said, "I want my parents to understand what they did. Not just the money, the choice. They kept this from me for 18 months. While I was planning a wedding around a number that was disappearing every time I looked away." She said, "Do you want to handle it privately?" I sat with that. My parents had asked me, twice since the phone call, to come for dinner. Each time with the subtext that we could work something out. That they would help make up the difference somehow. That this didn't have to be a bigger thing than it was. They were asking me to absorb it quietly. Which is what I'd always done. Which is what had created space for this. I said, "The anniversary party is in 8 days. The whole family will be there," Natalie said. "Jess," I said. "My grandmother built that fund for 20 years. Every birthday, every Christmas. Part of what could have gone elsewhere." She said, "I know." I said, "My aunts contributed. Cousins who didn't have to. People who believed they were doing something for me." She said, "I know." I said, "My parents made 41 transfers from that account without telling me. The last one was 2 weeks ago. For the anniversary trip Daniel is announcing on Saturday." Natalie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to help me make sure I don't say anything I don't mean. That I say only what's true and only what's necessary." She said, "I can do that." My mother called on Thursday evening. She said, "Jess, we'd love to see you before Saturday. Can you come for dinner Friday?" I said, "I'll be at the party on Saturday." She said, "I know, I just thought, before everyone's together." I said, "I'll see you Saturday, Mom." She was quiet. She said, "Okay." She meant it as a question. My father called on Friday morning. He said, "Your mother's worried about you." I said, "I know." He said, "Jess, we're going to make this right. We've been talking and we have a plan." I said, "I'll hear it on Saturday." He said, "Honey, I'm not sure the party is the right." I said, "I'll see you Saturday, Dad." I'd had the conversation I needed to have. Everything else could wait until Saturday. Have you ever been asked to handle something quietly when you knew quiet was exactly what had let it happen? If you understand that specific kind of pressure, type Enoch in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Because Saturday is coming. Saturday morning. 8:43. Ryan and I were having coffee when my phone rang. "Daniel?" I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I answered. He said, "Hey, Jess, excited for tonight?" I said, "I'm looking forward to seeing everyone." He said, "Claire's been really stressed about the planning, but it came together great. Restaurant's fantastic." I said, "Sounds wonderful." He said, "You okay?" You sound a little flat, I said. Just waking up. I'll see you tonight. He hung up. He hadn't called to check on me. He'd called to confirm I was in a good mood for his party. He didn't know what I knew. He just didn't know it yet. Ryan brought me a second cup of coffee without being asked. He sat across from me and said, "You ready?" I said, "Almost." I went to the drawer where I kept the file I'd prepared. The transaction history printed. The timeline I'd made, linking each transfer to a family event or contribution. The original opening balance from Grandma Ruth's account setup. And one more thing I'd found in the box of family documents my mother had given me years ago for safekeeping. Grandma Ruth's recipe card. Jess's wedding fund. Opening balance. $4,200. Her handwriting. Firm and precise. Written when I was 12. I put the recipe card on top of the stack. Then I closed the folder and put it in my bag. What do you think happened when I walked into that restaurant? Option A. Daniel had been told by my parents that I knew, and he tried to apologize before the meal. Option B. My parents pulled me aside at the door and begged me not to say anything in front of the family. Option C. Sus. Nobody knew I had the folder, and the dinner started as though everything was perfectly fine. Drop your answer in the comments. Because all three of those things seemed possible when I walked through that door. And only one of them was true. Actually, let me stop here for a moment, because before I tell you what happened at the restaurant, I need to tell you about Friday night. Ryan was asleep, 11:30. The house quiet. I was at the kitchen table with Grandma Ruth's recipe card in my hands. I'd been sitting there for 40 minutes. I thought about the November afternoon when she'd shown it to me. The cinnamon smell. The pale blue shortbread tin. The way she'd said, "I want you to know it exists." She had spent years building something for me. She had told my parents where it was, trusted them to protect it, and then she had died. And in the years after her death, it had been used for someone else's deposit, someone else's car, someone else's kitchen renovation, someone else's vacation to Italy. The tears came without warning. Not a collapse. A quiet overflow that I let happen, alone in the kitchen on a Friday night. I cried because I had trusted the right people, and the right people had not been trustworthy. Because the thing Grandma Ruth had built over 20 years had been used in a way she never intended. Because she had said, "A gift takes more meaning when the person knows it was built for them." And I had only now understood how much it meant. In the moment of understanding, it was gone. I sat with it. Then I wiped my face, put the recipe card back on top of the folder, went to the sink, drank a glass of water, went back to the table and sat for one more minute. I thought about what I wanted. Not from the party, not from my parents' reaction or Daniel's face when he understood what was happening. What I wanted was simple. I wanted my wedding fund back. I wanted my brother and my parents to say, clearly and without conditions, that what had happened was wrong. And I wanted my wedding. Not a diminished version. Not a "we'll figure it out." The wedding we'd planned around the number that had been promised. That was specific. That was achievable. And tomorrow was the day I was going to begin building toward it. I closed the folder, put it in my bag next to my keys, and went to bed. If your grandmother or grandfather or any person who loved you built something specifically for you, something that required years of intention, and you found out later what it cost them, tell me in the comments. I want to hear it. And now let me tell you what happened at the restaurant. If you guessed option C, the dinner starting as though everything was perfectly fine, you're right. Nobody had called Daniel. My parents had clearly hoped I would come to the party, see the family, and let the occasion neutralize the conversation. That whatever I was going to say could wait until after, until the party was over, until the wine had made everything slightly softer. They had misjudged the situation. The restaurant was warm, crowded with family. Daniel and Claire at the head of the long table, looking like what they were, a couple celebrating 3 years of marriage in a restaurant they'd chosen to impress. My aunts were there, my cousin from out of town. My parents at the near end of the table, who caught my eye when I walked in and held it for a second too long. I sat down, kissed my cousin, hugged my aunt, said hello to Claire, who said, "So Gedusha, see you, Jess. I heard congratulations are in order for you and Ryan." I said, "Thank you. We're in the planning stages." She smiled. She didn't know. Nobody knew. We ordered. The noise of the table was the specific warmth of a large family group, overlapping conversations, someone laughing at something at the far end, my cousin's toddler briefly escaping her chair. At 8:22, Daniel stood up. He tapped his wine glass. The table quieted. He said, "Claire and I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here. 3 years. And we're starting our 4th year with something we've been planning for a while." He reached for Claire's hand. He said, "We're taking 2 weeks in Europe this summer. Italy, France, and Spain. Something we've wanted to do since before we got married. Mom and Dad. He looked at my parents. Thank you for everything. Always. My mother beamed. My father raised his glass. I looked at my father. I reached into my bag. The folder was there. I took it out. Quietly, without drama, the way you take out something you've been carrying for a week. I placed the 3 pages of the bank statement on the table in front of my father's wine glass. He looked at it. The color left his face in a specific way, not sudden, but progressive, like something cooling. My mother was still looking at Daniel. Then she followed my father's gaze. She saw the statement. She saw the account number. She looked at me. I said quietly, in the space between the end of Daniel's toast and the beginning of the applause, "That's the account number for my wedding fund." The table was mid-celebration. Most people hadn't heard. My father picked up the statement. My mother pressed her hand flat on the tablecloth. Daniel was still standing, wine glass raised, still expecting applause that had started at the far end of the table and was working its way toward us. Then he saw my father's face. He saw the pages. He sat down slowly. Claire looked between all of us. My aunt, 2 seats down, was the first to understand that something had happened. She looked at the pages in my father's hands, then at Daniel, then at me. She said, "Jess, what is this?" I said, "It's the transaction history for my wedding fund, the one my grandmother set up. 22 months of outgoing transfers. $27,200. I set the timeline document on the table beside the statement. I said, "Each transfer is matched to a date here. On the right, a corresponding family event or contribution, a deposit into the fund, then a withdrawal 2 to 4 weeks later." The table had gone quiet in stages. The far end was still talking. The near end was not. My father said, "Jess, not here." I said, "Dad, the last transfer was 14 days ago. The memo line says, for Dan and Claire anniversary trip." I set the recipe card on top of everything. Grandma Ruth's handwriting. Blue ink. Firm and precise. Jess's wedding fund. Opening balance, $4,200. My father stared at it. My mother put her hand over her mouth. Daniel said, "Jess." I looked at him. I said, 3 years. That's how long you've been celebrating your marriage." I paused. I said, "This is how long I've been building mine." The toddler at the far end of the table said something. Her mother responded. A small, ordinary exchange in the warm noise of a restaurant that had, at our end, gone very still. The consequences fell like dominoes. Each one made a sound. My father paid the bill. He also stood at the restaurant door for 20 minutes talking to my aunt, who had known Grandma Ruth's intentions because she had contributed to the fund herself, $2,000 over 4 years, in birthday checks to me she had designated for the wedding. She had watched the table when I read the transaction history. She'd understood it immediately. She told me later that what she said to my father was measured, that she'd stood at the restaurant door and said, "Alan, your mother built that account over 20 years. She showed it to me. She showed it to Jess. I gave money to that account specifically. I need you to tell me what you're going to do." She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She asked the one question that required an answer. Daniel and Claire drove home without speaking to me directly. Daniel had tried, in the parking lot, hand on my arm, voice low, the beginning of an explanation I didn't need to hear that night. I had said, "Not tonight, Daniel. Call me next week." He had called the following Tuesday. That conversation was 40 minutes long, and I'm not going to detail all of it here, because some things belong only to the people in them. What I will tell you is that he said, "I kept thinking it was a loan. I kept telling myself I'd put it back before you needed it." I said, "How many times did you ask them?" A pause. He said, "I don't know exactly." I said, 41. That's how many transactions are on the statement. He was quiet. He said, "I didn't know it was that many." I said, "That's because you didn't look at the account." He said, "Jess." I said, "Daniel, neither of us can undo this. What I need to know is whether you're going to put it back." He said, "Yes." I said, "All of it." He said, "Yes." I said, "I'm going to need that in writing, with a timeline. And I need Mom and Dad involved in the agreement, because this didn't happen without them." He said, "I know." He said it the way people say things when they finally, fully understand what they did. My father called me on Friday of the same week. He said, "Your mother and I have been talking. We want to make this right." I said, "I know." He said, "We're going to put in whatever Daniel can't cover, whatever it takes." I said, I appreciate that. He said, Jess, I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry that hopes the problem goes away. I'm sorry in the way where I understand what I actually did. I chose to keep it from you. Every month, I told myself it was temporary. It wasn't. I said, I know. I said, I need time. But I'm not done being your daughter. He said, I know. One more person called. My cousin. 3 days after the dinner. She'd driven 4 hours to be at the party. She was a quiet woman who said very little and meant everything she said. She said, your grandmother showed me that card once. The recipe card. She was so proud of it. She said, I'm doing it slowly, but it's going to be real by the time Jess needs it. She was quiet. She said, she'd want you to know it was real, even if what happened after wasn't right. I said, I know it was real. She said, okay. That was all. The restitution was formalized 2 months after the anniversary dinner. My parents and Daniel agreed to a structured repayment. My parents contributed immediately from their own savings $12,000. Daniel committed to a monthly payment plan for the remainder, documented and signed, with my cousin's husband, a financial advisor, as a third party to the agreement. The total restored over 6 months, $27,200. Every penny. My wedding fund now holds $28,411. More than it would have held if none of this had happened because of interest. I'm not sure what to do with the irony of that. The relationship with my parents is in a different place than it was before. Not worse, exactly. More honest. The kind of honest that requires something to crack before it's possible. My father calls me on Sundays now. He has always called, but these calls are different. Longer. He asks questions he didn't used to ask. He listens to the answers in a way that feels like he's understanding that he doesn't know my life as well as he assumed. My mother came to help me try on dresses in March. It was a small appointment, just the two of us. She cried, predictably, at the third dress. She said, your grandmother would have loved this. I said, I know. She said, I'm going to spend a long time being sorry. I said, then spend it doing things that show it. Don't just carry the sorry around. She nodded. Daniel and I have had 3 phone calls since the Tuesday conversation, each one slightly more normal than the last. We are working towards something that isn't what we were before. Because what we were before had a secret in it, and you can't go back to a version of something that only existed because a thing was hidden. What we're working toward is honest. It's slower. It's more deliberate. It might be better. I kept the recipe card. It's in the tin where Grandma Ruth kept it. Pale blue, tartan pattern, slightly dented on one corner from 40 years of use. It sits on the bookshelf in our living room. Ryan found it there when he was looking for something else. He picked it up. Read the card. He put it back without saying anything. Later he said, she loved you very specifically. I said, yes. He said, we should invite her to the wedding somehow. I said, how do you mean? He said, I don't know yet, but the card should be there. I said, it will be. The wedding is in September. Ryan is handling the venue. I am handling the flowers, which I understand is a reversal of the expected arrangement, but he has strong feelings about outdoor spaces and I have strong feelings about peonies. We are within budget. We are within budget because $27,200 was returned to the account where it belonged, and because Grandma Ruth spent 20 years building something that survived what was done to it. I've been thinking about what I learned. Not about my parents or Daniel, about trust. I trusted without verifying for 9 years. Not because I was naive, I think I was reasonable, actually. You shouldn't need to audit a fund your family is holding for you. You shouldn't need to check whether each contribution is still there. That level of vigilance inside a family isn't trust, it's management. But there is a version of trust that is different from verification, and it's this knowing what was promised, knowing what form the promise took, and being willing to ask clearly when the accounting doesn't add up. I had the information. I knew the opening balance. I knew roughly what contributions had come in. I just never asked my parents to walk me through the current number, because asking felt like distrust, which is how a promise disappears. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic moment. In 41 transactions over 22 months, each one small enough that no single one requires confrontation, and in aggregate, they become something that requires a printed bank statement at an anniversary dinner to make visible. My grandmother knew this. She wrote the opening balance on a recipe card and showed it to me at 12 years old because she wanted me to know the number. She wanted me to have the number in my head. She was giving me something to verify against. I had the number. I just hadn't looked. I'm looking now. Not at everything. not with suspicion, but at the things that matter to me, with enough attention to know when something doesn't add up. That's not distrust. That's love applied with clarity. I didn't win against my family. There's no winning when the people who take from you are the people who were supposed to protect what someone else built for you. You don't get back the 18 months of planning you did around the wrong number. You don't get the easy feeling of never having had to know any of this. But you get the truth. And you get to build on what's actually there. Not on what you assumed, what's actually there. The tin is on the shelf. The card is inside. September. Has someone ever taken something that was meant for you and told themselves it was temporary? And has the accounting ever finally come due? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Type receipt in the comments if this story landed with you. Subscribe and hit the bell. A new story every day. Check the description for more stories like this one. I'll see you tomorrow.